Hello, and thank you so much for being here with me to watch this lecture video. So this video is going to be the first in our Module 1 series talking about psychology as a science. And this video in particular is going to talk about the problem with truthiness. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump right into the video. So I mentioned in my earlier welcome video that I am a cognitive psychologist by training. So that means that I specialize in the scientific study of the mind. And my particular area of expertise is in learning and memory. So when people find out that I am a memory expert, so to speak, I get a lot of fairly predictable questions, right? So some of them kind of make sense. So a lot of times people want to know more about things like Alzheimer's and dementia or photographic memory, for example. And other times I meet educators. So I meet K through 12 teachers, and I meet other college professors who want to kind of pick my brain about the most optimal strategies they can implement in the classroom to help students learn. And invariably, one of the strategies that comes up in these discussions is the notion of learning styles, right? So pretty much from elementary school, I can bet that you guys have had some exposure to this idea, right? So the notion with learning styles is that we all have individual preferences for how we like to learn. And if our instructor or our teacher tailors their classroom materials to our learning preferences, we would remember the information better, right? So when it comes to learning styles, there are all different types. So if you're a verbal learner, you prefer to be exposed to primarily words, right? So words and text and speech and writing, things like that. If you're a visual learner, you prefer things like diagrams and illustrations. If you're an auditory learner, you prefer rhythm and music. If you're a physical or kinesthetic learner, you prefer movement and tactile stimulation. If you're a social learner, you prefer to build relationships and so on. And in fact, I have even heard of a learning style that is based on sense of smell, right? So if you're a smelling learner, you prefer things like flowers and other things like that with fragrant senses to aid in your learning. So specifically, the argument with learning styles is the idea that individuals are going to differ with respect to what mode of instruction is going to be most effective or most optimal for them. And so proponents of this learning styles approach basically argue that optimal instruction is going to necessitate diagnosing individuals' learning styles, right? So if you want to be a good instructor, according to this theory, you have to test your students and see what mode of instruction they prefer, and then tailor their instruction accordingly. Right? So this is the notion of the meshing hypothesis. If you mesh your students' learning style with the instruction you provide for them, they're going to remember more information than they would otherwise. Okay? So an important question becomes, how do we assess learning styles, or how do we determine what type of learning style you prefer? Well, assessments of learning style typically ask people to evaluate what sort of information presentation they prefer, right? So do you prefer words? Do you prefer pictures? Do you prefer speech? And also, along with those preferences, what sort of mental activity are you going to find most engaging or most enjoyable? Right? So do you prefer listening to a lecture? Do you prefer analyzing a text? And so on. So typically assessments of learning styles are going to look like this. Right? So for example, you might see a series of statements and have to either agree or disagree with them. So I usually prefer diagrams, pictures, and mind maps. That would be a visual learner. I often fidget and want to move around. That would be a physical learner. I use rhymes and musical jingles to memorize information. That would be an auditory learner. I learn best when I discuss my work with someone else, right? That would be a relational or social learner. Okay, so how common is this notion of learning styles? Well, there have been literally thousands upon thousands of articles written about the subject of learning styles and dozens of books. And one article actually found 71 different theories of learning styles, and that wasn't even an exhaustive or complete list. So why is this so pervasive? Well, there's a lot to be gained by studying or by being a proponent of learning styles. So it's a very lucrative industry in that it's very financially rewarding, right? So one of the primary reasons why it's so lucrative is because you need things like assessment materials to diagnose your students' learning style, and you also need materials that are going to enhance your classroom and help you to teach in a way that facilitates or encourages each individual student's learning style, right? So it's a very lucrative industry because we need all of these materials in order to do what the meshing hypothesis encourages us to do. So just another example of how pervasive this idea of learning styles is. So I have two examples here. One is from Yale University's College of Education website. And it says, college students enter our classrooms with a wide variety of learning styles, assess them, and make instructional choices accordingly, right? So that is the advice dispensed by an Ivy League institution to its educators. In an educational psychology textbook, it says, some cognitive styles and dispositions do seem to influence how and what students learn. Some students seem to learn better when information is presented through words, whereas others seem to learn better when it's presented through pictures. Okay, so it seems like this idea makes sense, right? It seems fairly intuitive, but how can we scientifically assess the claim that students will learn best when instructional techniques match their individual learning styles, right? So maybe pause the video here and think for a second about how we can design a scientific study that would tell us whether learning styles or whether tailoring your instruction to individual students' learning styles would lead to superior learning, right? Well, I have one example of a paper that was published where this was the primary research question. So Massa and Mayer divided participants into visual and verbal learners based on their self-reported preferences. So they gave them an assessment just like the one I showed you earlier in this video, where they had to say yes or no to a series of statements, asking them what their presentation preferences were and what activities they found most engaging. And that told them whether a participant was a visual or verbal learner. And then they asked them to complete a computer-based electronics lesson with 2 different help screens. So the visual learners were given a help screen that included diagrams and illustrations, while the verbal learners were given supplementary text. And what they found is that there was no benefit on a subsequent test when help screen modality matched participants' preferences. Right? So this experiment seems to very definitively suggest that self-reported preferences, right, and tailoring instruction to self-reported preferences doesn't seem to yield any sort of benefits when it comes to how well people are actually learning something. And in fact, this is one of many, many experiments showing no benefit when instruction is tailored to students' individual learning styles. And in fact, there was what's called a meta-analysis conducted looking at this research question, where they actually looked at hundreds of different experiments to see collectively if there was any benefit when participants were divided into various conditions based upon their preferences. So across not only this study, but also hundreds of other studies, there was no confirmed benefit when your instruction when your instruction is tailored to your individual learning style. Okay? So as intuitive as the notion of learning styles is, there doesn't seem to be a lot of scientific evidence to support it. So another question I get a lot as a cognitive psychologist is I have concerned parents who come to me and ask, are there specific activities I can do with my infant or with my toddler that's going to make them more intelligent, or it's going to make them perform better as a student when they eventually start school? And one of the things that people talk about using for their child are games and apps and toys and videos manufactured by a company called Baby Einstein. So if you're following along in PowerPoint right now in using your lecture notes, I would encourage you to pause the video and click on the hyperlink I've included on the title of this slide, because that will take you to a video that's essentially a commercial for Baby Einstein. And in that advertisement, it says specifically the actors who are pretending to be parents of an infant say that they can literally see their child's mind expanding as they are watching this video, or as they're watching Baby Einstein videos. And that's a pretty significant claim to make. Okay, so let's look at the scientific evidence here, right? So how do we scientifically assess whether having an infant watch a video actually expands their mind or makes them more intelligent? So I have one example of a scientific study that was conducted to assess this claim. So in this particular experiment, there were 3 conditions, or 3 different groups of participants. And the participants in this case were infants. So in one group, the infant watched a Baby Einstein DVD that was designed to encourage vocabulary learning. And they watched that video 5 days a week, or 5 times a week, for a month. So they watched the video 5 times a week for 4 weeks. Okay, so that was one condition. And In another condition, they looked at babies who had not watched the video. Right? So there's a Einstein video watching condition, a no Einstein video watching condition, and a third condition where the parents were given a list of the vocabulary words featured on the Baby Einstein DVD, and they were told to work with their child, again, 5 times a week for 4 weeks, and try to help their child learn those words using any strategy or method that came naturally to them. Okay? So again, they looked at kids who watched the Baby Einstein video, kids that did not watch it, or kids that learned the same vocabulary words from their parents without watching the video. And what they found in this particular experiment is that the kids that watched the Baby Einstein video learned no more vocabulary words than children who were not exposed to the video. Right? So there was literally no difference between those kids that watched the video and those that did not. And the kids that learned or worked with the vocabulary words with their parents learned more words than either of the other groups. Okay, so simply as a parent, working with your child on learning vocabulary words is going to be far more helpful than trying to get your kid to learn them from a video, right? So what is the take-home message here? Well, both of the examples that I gave you guys, learning styles and Baby Einstein videos, illustrate something called truthiness. So truthiness is a term that was coined by Stephen Colbert, and it refers to our tendency to believe that something is the truth simply because doing so feels right in our gut. So in spite of facts to the contrary, right, we sometimes accept an idea, belief, or conclusion because it makes sense to us without actually considering the supporting evidence. Right? So why is this relevant in a research methods and statistics course? Well, it's relevant because as psychological scientists, it's our job to distinguish between intuition, right, and scientific evidence, right? So we are going to use the scientific method to evaluate claims and determine whether our intuition is correct or not, right? So that's going to be our task throughout this course, okay, is to distinguish between unsubstantiated intuition and scientific fact. Okay? All right, so I hope you enjoyed this first video. And in my next video, I'm going to continue our discussion of the limitations of intuition and different ways that our intuition can lead us to the wrong conclusion. Okay? All right, so I look forward to seeing you in my next video, and I will see you soon.